really sharp run sheet. Andrew Johnson, CEO of ACS. Just wanted to extend a very special welcome to members of our New South Wales branch executive, industry partners like McAfee, a lot of ACS fellows, Michael Johnson, Professor from Macquarie University, Steve Godby, Anthony Wonga Media, past president, Simeon, part of our technical committees, and obviously we'll introduce Johan as our president in a short moment. ACS has been really happy to collaborate with ASPI over a short period of time, and there's lots to be talking about in the cyberspace. I'm not going to steal any thunder, so I'm going to introduce you to Fergus Hansel, who heads up the International Cyber Centre for ASPI, and followed by Johan, and then we'll bring Chris in. Thank you, Fergus.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you very much for having me here this morning. I just want to say a very big thank you to Andrew and Johan for partnering with us again on this paper. It's a small research institute, we just couldn't do it without you, so I really, really appreciate that support. This morning we're fortunate to be joined by one of the pioneers in the cyber world, Chris Painter, who built up his reputation prosecuting some of the world's earliest and most high-profile hacking cases, including that of Kevin Mitnick. He's been at the vanguard of US and international cyber issues for over a quarter century, first as a leading federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice, at the FBI, at the National Security Council, and finally as the world's first top cyber diplomat at the US State Department. He's helped drive, initiate, or been involved in pretty much every major US cyber policy issue over the last decade. He's also a wonderful person to spend time with. A couple of months ago we were very fortunate to have Chris as a resident at the Institute, and through that we're able to sort of hear firsthand how some of the world's biggest cyber deals are actually done, and all in Chris's very genial and thoughtful style. It was during that visit that Chris came up with the idea for this paper, and I'm absolutely delighted that ACS has been able to make that happen and this publication possible. Over the last 6 months we've had the highest intensity of cyber attack attributions in history, so this paper really couldn't come at a more opportune time. And the threats that we continue to see from nation states really show how much we've still got to, how far we've still got to go. And Chris's suggestions on the way forward there, I think, couldn't really come from a more authoritative source. Among many things, Chris is a distinguished non-resident fellow at the International Cyber Policy Centre. He's a commissioner on the Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, and a member of the Board of Directors for the Centre of Internet Security. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Johan to say a few words. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Fergus, and thank you very much for all of you for being here. Very good morning and good evening to you, Chris, from New York. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we're meeting this morning, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are present here today, especially given it's the night of week that it's really important that we recognise the Indigenous people of the land which we are here. Thank you very much. It's really, really exciting to be here, and really exciting to be launching this particular publication with ASPI. And it was only the last week that we heard about the news about attack attributed to the Russian hacking group, known alternatively as Sofesi, APT28, and Fancy Bear. I always wonder who actually names these people, because they come up with some really, really interesting names. It was the same group that attacked the Russian, same group that has links to the Russian intelligence agency, the GRU. And it's the same group that was linked to the system hacking of the DNC and the released emails of the Clinton campaign during the presidential election. Their latest achievement, if you call it an achievement, was to hack 500,000 internet routers. Most of the routers were in Ukraine, but the damage that was done was felt by people across the world. The hack, before it was neutered by the FBI, gave them almost complete control over the routers. And they could monitor internet traffic, disable routers, and run botnets using the processing power of those routers. Again, this has happened, but there's likely to be no repercussions. It's simply, we seem to be turning a blind eye to all these actions. So what are we actually going to do about this? We're seeing more and more of the sabotage of these ICT systems. And the ICT systems don't discriminate, whether it's an attack on the nations or the citizens or the businesses. So it's really important that we make sure that the regular people are protected. So our part of ACS's strategy is to make sure the ACS, ACS enables Australia to have the capacity and the capability of the ICT professionals, and to be a catalyst for innovation and change. And that's why we partnered with ASPI, and we're really, really pleased to be launching this framework. And you heard about Chris, he doesn't need any more introductions. And you're here to listen to Chris. Chris, without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, and we're pleased that you partnered with ASPI and through ASPI with us, and we look forward to your what you have to say this morning. Over to you.
Great, and thanks. It's good to be there with you virtually. I've been traveling the world recently. I just got back from Tallinn, Estonia, and was in Brussels before that, and then Bratislava before that. So it's good to be home, or almost home, because I'm in DC. But it's also good to connect with you in Australia. And I think this issue, as you noted, we've seen, and over the course of my career, I've seen the cyber attackers become ever more clever and sophisticated. But what we've seen really in the last couple of years is a substantial increase in state-sponsored cyber attacks, and ones that we've been able to attribute. Things like, certainly back a couple of years ago when China was stealing our intellectual property, not just ours, but Australia's and other, more theft of information that we attributed to them, but also the very damaging NotPetya attack that started in Ukraine, but really spread throughout the world and caused major damage to Maersk and Denmark and really systems around the world that we attributed to Russia, that was collectively attributed to Russia by the US, Australia, and others. And the WannaCry worm, which was attributed to North Korea. And there's been even recently, there was a joint report between our Department of Homeland Security and FBI attributing war combat to North Korea. So what we've seen, and then of course there was the election interference in the US by Russia, and that's also been seen in Europe. A different kind of attack, a more hybrid attack, not just a cyber attack, but a cyber attack married with an influence operation. I don't think we saw it coming as the cyber professionals. But what we've seen is this growing rise in terms of this malicious conduct sponsored by states. And we've been doing a lot of work in the US and Australia and countries around the world in trying to come up with what is acceptable behavior in cyberspace. What should states do? Obviously, it's grounded in international law, but the problem with international law is that only really deals with the very high-end stuff where you have death or destruction. You don't usually see that in cyberspace. You see a lot of activity below that. So we've been working on norms of behavior. Norms are essentially, what the expectations of state behavior are in cyberspace. They shouldn't be attacking critical infrastructure. They shouldn't be attacking certs, etc. But all that work that we've done in trying to promulgate norms around the world, and we've done a lot of good work there, is really loses a lot of force if there are no consequences for the people and the states that violate those norms. The analogy I draw in the physical world is that, in the criminal world, if someone breaks into your house all the time, and even though you do everything to lock the windows and doors, that's not really a solution because they're not deterred. They'll come back and they'll do it stronger. They'll be emboldened. And the same thing I think is happening in cyberspace, where by not taking decisive action against the nation states that have been doing this, that actually imposes some costs that they care about on them in a timely manner. They're basically thinking of this as a cost-free exercise. And as a cost-free exercise, they're likely, and in fact have, been emboldened to do it again. So part of an overall deterrence strategy, and deterrence is a very broad topic. It deals with everything from hardening the targets and being more resilient, which we absolutely have to do, to law enforcement actions we need to take, which are important. But also, I think it involves imposing costs on bad actors, whether they be state or non-state actors, and to do it in a timely fashion that actually is meaningful to them. So timely and credible circumstances. And that means both for the things that they're doing now, but also as a warning to them so they'll think twice about doing in the future. We really haven't been very good either individually as countries or together in doing that. Now, I applaud, I think there's been a lot of good work recently in doing collective attribution of some of the big cyber attacks we've seen. NotPetya and WannaCry are good examples where a number of countries, including Australia and the US, have joined together, and that's great. But when you're talking North Korea, when you're talking Russia, naming and shaming is not sufficient alone. It's a good first step, but you're unlikely to deter Russia or North Korea by naming and shaming. You really have to go a step further. And that step further is actually imposing meaningful consequences on them. And I think there's a number of reasons we haven't done that in the past. One of them is that attribution is difficult, and that's certainly true, but attribution is not impossible. We were able to do attribution in all the cases I mentioned. It took us 6 months or 6.5 months to announce that attribution for NotPetya and WannaCry. Part of that was technical challenges in doing attribution, to be sure, but part of it was also challenges in terms of interagency coordination, international coordination, and even political will to make that attribution and to say something publicly that all can be short. And one thing that I found in this area is in the physical world, and it's true we've gotten better about this, but in the physical world, leaders understand what's happening when you have a physical attack. They understand it viscerally, they're able to respond to it and take action. The Salisbury poisoning is a good example. In 3 days, you had attribution to Russia and you had substantial action taken. In cyber, assuming we can get the attribution right, there's still this lag that I think is in part attributable to senior policymakers in governments around the world not really understanding cyber, still thinking of it as a niche issue or a boutique issue, and not really understanding it as a core national security issue, and treating it like that, not treating it as this technical issue, but one where we really have to take action to make it safer. To me, a good example of that was when we had the widespread theft of intellectual property by China. In the US, President Obama at the time said that this was something that was not just a cyber issue, but a core issue of our national and economic policy. And we were willing to take friction in the overall relationship between China and the US unless it was addressed. And that made a difference. Through sustained activity over 2 years, that actually made a difference. And so that was important. We haven't done that across the board with some of these other activities, and I think we have to. And that means high-level attention at the very highest levels, from presidents and prime ministers. I think in Australia there is very high-level attention on this. That's great. We've had high-level attention in the U.S., although I had some real concerns recently when the cyber coordinator in the White House has been is not being replaced, and that sends a bad message in terms of priority. It also sends a bad message in terms of someone who can actually mainstream this issue there. But we need to treat this like any other national and economic security issue. We also need, as I said, to shorten the attribution cycle, and that's important too. We need to work with other states to do that. But we also have to actually use the tools we have and use them in an effective way that's actually going to make a difference to the adversary. General sanctions usually don't really work. You have to tailor the activities you're taking to the adversary you're thinking about. What's going to make a difference to them? And use all the tools at your disposal consistent with international law. So everything from diplomatic tools, economic tools, cyber tools. Unlikely you're going to use kinetic tools unless it's really a big incident where death and destruction is caused, but really, and also thinking about what other tools we can have. This is something where I think there's certainly willingness to do that in the US and Australia. The US national strategy released a few months ago talked about imposing swift and sure consequences on bad actors in cyberspace. That was great. Just today, the State Department released a summary of their international engagement strategy and their deterrence strategy, which also talked about imposing consequences on bad actors and some of the things that need to be done to do that. And I think that's really important and very much along the lines of what I talked about in the report. One of the things that report, and I said in my report as well, is that we need to have, if you have the flaming ball of cyber death coming toward you, every country has to be able to do what it needs to do to defend itself. But at the same time, it's always better in terms of credibility, in terms of actual impact, if we can act together as countries. And so that's important. So I think that the real missing piece has been our inability to do timely, credible consequences and costs on bad actors, state actors especially. Criminal, I think, is a little easier. I mean, doing better prosecutions, doing more international prosecutions, we know where to go on that. But state actors, I think, still have been getting away with this often scot-free, and that's caused all of us some real problems. So I think that's a change we need. I acknowledge that's not without complications. There are a number of them. One, if you're going to do things collectively with other countries, you have to be able to share information with them. I remember back when North Korea attacked Sony Pictures, back when I was in the government, I called up about 20 of my counterparts around the world and asked for their support in condemning North Korea's actions, and quite frankly and fairly, they asked for as much information as we could provide before President Obama went out that next day and attributed the actions to North Korea and said we would take actions. We need to find a way to share that often sensitive information with partners to get them on the same page we are, and I think we need to exercise that muscle mass to make sure that that's done quickly and better. We need to figure out what circumstances, what costs we can actually impose, and think about how the escalation works in cyberspace. Escalation is not well defined in cyberspace. We are still in the beginning of a lot of this stuff, but if we're communicating with the bad actor and telling them what we're doing and why we're doing it, that goes a long way to control that sort of escalation. So I'm not suggesting we open the floodgates and do everything and make cyberspace less secure and more unstable. I'm suggesting we do this in a targeted, responsible way and communicate that with our adversaries and doing it with partners. So there's a number of things I lay out in the paper that I think are useful steps in how to build these partnerships, how we can start thinking about information sharing. The State Department paper that came out today also talked about coming up with a schedule of costs, of the things that you would do and communicating that both to friends and to adversaries or frenemies. I think that's very good too. But we're really losing time. I think the longer we go with either doing ineffective actions or no actions at all, we're sending a message to the bad guys out there, and they're going to continue their actions. There's no reason they wouldn't do it. We've seen a number of state actors from Iran, North Korea, Russia, and others, and I don't see any reason why they would stop. This doesn't solve all of our problems in cyberspace, to be sure. As I said, we still need to harden our systems. We need to have much better cyber hygiene, both of companies and individuals around the world. We need to have better international cooperation generally. We should continue to promulgate norms of behavior around the world and international law. That's important too. But at the same time, we also have to address this issue because I think it's been a glaring hole in the way we've dealt with this. I think this is something that the US, Australia, and other countries are now focused on. It's not, again, going to be an easy course because a lot needs to be figured out. But it's something that I think we can't really let this go on much longer because we'll just get more instability, we'll get more of these attacks, and I don't see that lessening anytime soon. With that, I think it'd be useful to open up to questions. I'd like to make this as interactive as possible given the format we have. And I encourage you to look at the paper. I think I try to lay out some good suggestions of the way forward, and also lay out some of the difficulties and challenges we had in doing that. But I don't think this is insurmountable. I don't think, for instance, attribution is impossible. We've done it. I think we could do that quicker. I don't think imposing costs is impossible. I think we can also work productively with the private sector and civil society and figure out what new and interesting costs we can impose that we haven't thought of yet. We're limited to our tool set that states have, which are everything from the military, which is unlikely, to the cyber, to sanctions, to diplomatic options. But there may be things that we haven't thought about yet that the industry and others can help us think through to be more creative. And we need to do tailored strategies depending on the adversary. What do they care about? What will hold them dear so that they'll actually change their behavior in the future. So there's a lot of activity, a lot of work in this area, but we don't have time to lose. And I think this is something that we need to partner on, and we need to make a priority for all of our countries, and not a second order priority, but really a first order priority. So with that, Fergus, if it makes sense, maybe we can open it up to comments and questions, and I'm happy to take them.
That sounds great. Thanks, Chris. Microphone's in the roof, so please project upwards. Nikesh.
Hi, Chris, that was fantastic. And I think I really like what you said about attribution. But one of the big problems I think now is that while technical attribution is possible, and by that I mean the experts are able to attribute, what we're finding in the popular media and etc. And I don't want to name a certain president of the country, but there's a lot of denial that's taking place. So that, you know, it's almost equivalent to the greenhouse gas denial. So how do we bridge that gap between popular attribution and technical attribution?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I mean, I think, you know, at the end of the day, attribution is a political decision. So you're never going to have 100% technical attribution. When I was a prosecutor, I never had 100% proof of any case. I mean, you know, even if you had a confession, it wasn't 100%. And that's not the standard. It's beyond a reasonable doubt in the U.S. That's the standard. And that's, you know, it's important to understand that. In cyberspace, you don't need 100% attribution. Some of the bad adversaries want that because they know it's an unreachable standard, but it has to be where the state feels comfortable making that attribution. And I think you're right. I think there are some challenges to that because even when you have a profound grounding and you think that there is, you know, high confidence in attribution, you're facing a couple challenges. One is there's sometimes a reticence making public attribution that might compromise sources and methods, and that's understandable. But there has been a trend, and I think a good trend, of doing more public attribution by the U.S., Australia, and others recently. I think that should be applauded. The second is, you know, yes, the adversary is going to deny it, but they'll deny physical things too. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they denied they did it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't call them out for it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't impose consequences for it. And the third issue I think you raised is actually getting that political willingness in our governments. That, you know, we need the leaders to talk about this. We need the leaders to actually take a role in this and not shy away from it, and you know, really make those public statements when called for. You're not going to make them in every case. We don't want to create a situation where the public expects us to attribute everything we know about, because when we don't attribute something, the implications we don't know about it. But we do need to have, I think, some pretty strong statements. And the other thing I'd say is if it does take a long time, either because of technical or political reasons, we need to be ready to marry a consequence with that when it happens. So, you know, not Penny, it was 6 months after the fact, and when we made that attribution, we said, and consequences will follow. And some did. I'd say they weren't strong enough, but they did follow, but they followed a month later. If you're going to do it 6 months after the fact, do it 7 months after the fact, and do it with some consequence that's going to be meaningful, so the public understands this is important. You know, I think the other issue on this is that you're never going to be able to prove to everyone that your attribution is correct. I remember for the North Korea cyber attack on Sony a while ago, we released a lot of information, law enforcement and other information. And before President Obama went out and said it was North Korea, everyone was saying it was North Korea. When he did go out and say it was North Korea, a lot of people say, oh, it's not North Korea, they're wrong. And we released a lot of evidence. We didn't release everything we have, and we never will, and no state will. But we were sure as North Korea, and we're still sure as North Korea. So you have to kind of get through that. I think it do a good job of outreach to the public, too, to try to convince them that when we say something, we mean it, and we're confident in it.
Question?
Chris Cummings from the Australian Security magazine. Do you think, one, I suppose, the definition of cyber war needs to be tidied up, or are we already at a cyber war? Two, does it risk escalation? And three, don't you see already the capabilities, the counter-offensive capabilities being built already with the last policy brief, even from ASPI, on the offensive capability of cyber?
So on first, I don't like the term cyber war because it's used very frequently and used, I think, as a term that gets a lot of attention. But you know, when I think cyber war, and I don't think we'll have a standalone cyber war as part of, as opposed to cyber being used as a capability in a traditional conflict. And I think every time we say everything it constitutes a cyber war, that's a little explosive. I mean, a cyber war to me is if you actually had that high level of damage that would trigger the right to self-defense. It doesn't mean that the attacks and the intrusions we have now are not serious. They're incredibly serious, and we need to treat them as serious, and we need to respond to them. But I don't think I'd call it necessarily cyber war. You know, other people have different views on that. but I think we're in a constant state of cyber conflict and adversaries going after us, and we just need to be able to respond. The second question on offensive capabilities, look, I think in practically every country around the world, if they have the ability to do it, are going to develop capabilities in cyberspace. And just like any other technology, that's going to happen. And we have to understand that. And I think, in fact, it's important for countries to have those tools in their toolkit, and to use them responsibly and to have a doctrine around them. So I think that is important to do. It doesn't mean you should open the floodgates, certainly. Again, you have to have a responsible way of using them that's consistent with international law, and I think that's important. But a lot of the work we've done around norms and behavior and expectations in cyberspace is not look at the cyber tools themselves, not say, it's, the Russians at one point said we should have a cyber treaty that would ban certain kinds of cyber weapons, and I really don't know what a cyber weapon is. But we looked in the norms area of what conduct, not the conduct itself, but what is the result that we think shouldn't happen. So in other words, don't say what the tool is, but let's agree that absent wartime, in wartime the rules are different, you have distinction and proportionality under international law. But in peacetime, let's agree that we're not going to go after the critical infrastructure of another country. Let's agree we're not going to go after the CERT or CSERT of another country, that we're not going to cause that damage, like going after the ambulance. Let's make a number of agreements like this. I'm now part, as was mentioned, of the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. And we've been also thinking about stability measures. It's a sort of multi-stakeholder group, very great group of folks. And we came out with two norms recently. One, not to attack the public core of the internet, in peacetime, because that would have widespread effects on everyone around the world, and not to attack countries shouldn't go after the technical infrastructure for election systems. It doesn't deal with the influence operation issue so much as going after the technical infrastructure. So I think, we need to do more in that area. And I think the third question you were asked about escalation, and this is a serious issue because the escalation paths are not well defined in cyberspace. The communication paths with other countries are not well defined. That's something we try to build with both countries we agree with and we didn't agree with. And we need to have that diplomatic channeling and ways to de-escalate. But that shouldn't prevent us from imposing costs for bad actions. We can do both. We can find ways to prevent escalation and do escalation control through confidence building measures, hotlines, points of contact. Those are all important. Of course, we need to be wary of it. And that's why I say simply imposing consequences doesn't mean we shouldn't think about the escalation. We shouldn't think about the second order consequences. We really have to think about all those things together.
Thanks, Chris.
Hi, Alex Zaharov-Reutt from ITY.com in Australia. I know you're talking about de-escalation and all these measures to stop people from making serious attacks on critical infrastructure, but how long is it before there is a serious attack on critical infrastructure, either by a friendly government, a rogue government, terrorists? I mean, I would suggest it's already happened and it just hasn't been widely reported.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Let's take terrorists first. I think terrorists are still more focused on causing death and destruction and not as much on attacking computer networks. Now that could change, and it might change very quickly, but so far that's been their goal. The kinds of major attacks on critical infrastructure, people have been predicting that literally for the last 15 years, and we've seen smaller attacks, and certainly we're very concerned about that. We need to be concerned about that. So I can't predict when that will happen. I think part of the issue has been that some of the adversaries who are out there are so, it's deterrence by entanglement, that they're entangled with our societies and dependent on them, so they don't have an incentive to go after our infrastructures. They have incentive to steal information, to be sure. They have incentive to have the capability of going after our infrastructure. But that certainly could happen in the future, depending on what's happening geopolitically. And I do worry about that. We need to be prepared for that. And part of that, again, is making our, having resilience, having, hardening the targets, having resilience even if things get attacked and go down, but then also being able to respond in such a way that they don't do that in the future or they think twice about doing it now. And those are all parts of the strategy we need to come up with. I know people have talked about a cyber 9/11 or a cyber Pearl Harbor now for a long time and it hasn't happened. I don't know if it will happen or when it will happen, but we still need to be prepared.
Thank you.
So, Chris, one of the measures, if you like, that we're being asked to take is to not buy Chinese components as part of our critical infrastructure, and instead use European or US components. When I've costed that out, so comparing an infrastructure built on Huawei or LTE versus an infrastructure built on Cisco or Ericsson, the cost difference is somewhere between 3 and 4 times. And we're finding that the kit that we've been given has Chinese or Indian componentry in it anyway. So 2 questions. Firstly, how effective is that measure to not buy Chinese? And is it really worth the 3 or 4 times overhead or penalty, whichever way you want to call it?
Look, I think it ends up being, like anything else, a risk management decision. And then the problem is that, moving to 5G as opposed to 4G. 4G, there were certain ways to mitigate the risk. You can keep equipment that you weren't trustful of out of the core. 5G, there is really no core. It's distributed. 4G, we're worried about communications. 5G, we're worried about communications, but also Internet of Things and infrastructure. So the risk profile is much higher. Then the second question is, well, how do you feel about the actor? And whether, and how trustworthy is the actor? And does the actor have either capability or intent to cause damage? Now, you could argue that Chinese companies do not have the present intent to disrupt Australians' infrastructure. However, intent can change very quickly, and there are companies that have a very strong government component, government control in certain circumstances. So let's say something goes wrong in the South China Sea, or something changes with Taiwan, or who knows what the geopolitical events would be. That intent could change very quickly. And then the third, final part of the analysis is, can you mitigate that? And I think it's harder to mitigate it when we're talking about 5G that's very distributed. And then, as you say, you have to balance that against the cost. And the cost is obviously a big driver for companies, but if it undermines the security long term, costs really don't get you there. So I don't pretend this is an easy decision, but it's a real risk management decision, and I think there's some real risks involved.
Time for a couple more if there are any.
Well, just going to add, does that mean that the US needs to invest in manufacturing, whether it's through robotics or whatever it is, to start creating some of its own technology so it can be secure in the knowledge that what it's buying is not tampered with?
It's an interesting question because, a lot of people, economists will say, that's industrial policy, we really can't do that. The reason that these are they're developed this way is they become commodities. And it's very hard to kind of have that, that forced, let's create these particular things to make sure the security is there. At the same time, security is important. So, I think there has to be an economic case for it too. That may be changing. I think the one time that happened in the past was with chips many years ago, where there was a U.S. effort to do some innovation around chips and funding that. So we'll see. I think, I remember back when we were in the midst of 3G saying, well, when we get to 5G, we really need to have a strategy for this, and I just don't think we have that strategy.
Time for one last question if there is one. Michael?
I'm convinced about the need for consequences. You make the argument very well. While you were describing it, you pointed out we'll be better with the criminal ones because we're cooperating better for international law, for individuals or criminal syndicates, but we also need to do it for state-sponsored activities. That's the source of my question. State-sponsored activities are often of the kind of espionage and are often, in fact, run by espionage organisations. And just looking back at the last century or so of espionage, and it's been happening for a long time, and I haven't seen many consequences in the ordinary non-cyber kind. So am I unaware of things that have happened, or are there things you can imagine that might be able to be done in the cyber world that are somehow different from other espionage activities?
Yeah, look, espionage is a difficult issue because intelligence gathering by countries has gone on since the beginning of time. And even when we reached the deal with the Chinese, that was prohibiting the theft of trade secrets, intellectual property to benefit the commercial sector. It didn't create a ban on countries gathering information because I don't think that's enforceable, frankly. That doesn't mean we have to be happy with it. When we had the major intrusions in espionage in our country, we could still respond by using certain things like, expelling diplomats, just like we do with normal espionage. There's a lot of things we can do, but I don't think we're going to create a norm that espionage is impermissible, because countries will do it no matter what. We did hive off that theft of intellectual property to benefit your commercial sector, because that's something we don't do, Australia doesn't do, no country should do, and the Chinese agreed to that. Are there circumstances in the past, but I do think, we have not just seen espionage, and again, I don't think we have to be happy about espionage. We need to make our systems more secure. We have to also do what we can to respond to it. But the things that I've talked about mostly in the paper are really not espionage, but the attacks on critical information systems, the large-scale theft of information. It's not just espionage, but it goes beyond that. And I think that that's something we're trying to deter generally. Espionage itself, I think we need to take seriously, and we need to do everything we could to prevent it. But I don't think we're going to be successful in creating a regime that says espionage is not permissible.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we please thank Chris for joining us late at night, and also his policy brief that he shared with us this morning. Thank you, Chris. There's still lots of breakfast left. If you can hang around for a tea or coffee, please help yourself. Also, lots of facilities if you need to knock a few emails over before your next meeting. Just once again wanted to say thank you to ASPI. This Australia's Offensive Cyber Capability Report is also there, along with Chris's Cyber Deterrence. Thanks once again for coming along this morning.
And thank all of you, and thanks for ASPI. It was a fun time being down there for a few weeks, and I always love coming on Thursday. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Chris.